world, welcome to today's China in Focus. I'm Evelyn Lee. Today we will bring you an outlook of China in 2022. We will go through the biggest China stories to watch out for in the coming year. One of the most important things for the world to look out for is the slowing down of China's economy. It matters so much because the country's economy has been one of the Communist Party's most effective tools, especially in proving its legitimacy to rule the Chinese people and the international community. Its power has proven so strong that concerns over its human rights abuses and lack of political freedom have largely been overlooked overseas. Usually, when anyone gives a less than cheerful prediction of the Chinese economy, the communist regime dismisses it as anti-China bias. But this time, the gloomy outlook comes from people affiliated with the regime itself. A meeting of top Communist Party leaders this month reported that the Chinese economy faces three sources of major pressure next year. That's contracting demand, a supply shock, and weakening expectations. And then there is a pandemic, as well as a complicated and uncertain international environment that's adding to the pressure. The meeting also stressed that ensuring stability is a top priority for next year's economic work. That's in contrast to Beijing's often ambitious expansion plans from previous years. Chinese Communist Party insiders say when the CCP stresses something, it suggests that something may be lacking. So party leaders could be worried about economic turbulence for the next year. And in a rare, harsh public statement, former Chinese Finance Minister Lou Jiwei criticized the Chinese regime's official economic data, accusing it of inaccuracies. Lou said the statistics don't properly report negative economic changes, and that the one-sided data makes it harder to assess the current forces overshadowing the economy. The state-affiliated economist warned in early December that the next few years could become the most difficult period for China's economy since its reform and opening up, a policy that began in the late 70s.
My understanding of our economic affairs is that we also need to make more difficult mental preparation.
Chairman of Taiwan's wealth magazine, Xie Jinhe, believes that through the mouth of economists in the system, the CCP intends to give a precaution to those citizens who still think China is doing amazing, telling them that the hard times are coming. Stop dreaming, tighten their belts, and be mentally prepared to face the future of sacrificing their wealth for their country. Here we list 7 major economic challenges facing Beijing authorities in 2022. First, a noteworthy trend. The Chinese economy's links with the world may be weakening. Let's take a look.
The correlation between China's GDP and other emerging markets fell from nearly perfect, or over 0.9, to barely visible, or under 0.2, from 2015 to today. This is according to a Morgan Stanley analyst's Financial Times column earlier this month. And in the second quarter of this year, for the first time in 3 decades, China's growth is clocking in at a much slower rate than other emerging markets. That's as the regime has been advocating for its economy to become self-reliant. Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping states that China must be self-sufficient in energy, food, and mineral mining, as resource shortages can prevent unexpected risks for the country's economy. Likewise, Xi Jinping told top policymakers in a December meeting that China needs to establish a strategic baseline for these key primary commodities. Though the goal may not be so easy to achieve, despite being known as the world's factory and largest exporter, China relies heavily on imports for goods essential to its economy. That includes agricultural products like soybeans, as well as energy resources like iron ore, crude oil, and natural gas.
And second, a crisis is looming over China's exports. It's a major predicament as exports are considered one of the 3 carriages driving the Chinese economy. Though China reported strong export numbers this year, some experts argue that's partially because of large-scale virus outbreaks in countries that are China's commercial rivals. That's Vietnam, India, and Malaysia, where businesses were shut because of the pandemic. But as Southeast Asia's outbreaks get more under control, China's exports are sliding down month over month for about the last quarter. In a press conference, researchers from China's top state-owned think tank issued a warning that as major economies recover from the pandemic, China's role as a substitute factory will weaken, and the effect on slowing exports will get more obvious in 2022. That's as China's labor costs have been on the rise for years. Labor there is becoming less competitive than some other Southeast Asian countries. Meanwhile, the U.S. and its allies are working to reduce supply chain reliance on China. That effort followed a powerful realization. The Chinese regime has been using economic coercion to achieve political goals, like banning Australian coal and red wine after the country asked for an investigation into the pandemic's origin, or banning Taiwanese pineapples to pressure and threaten the island. Many democracies are now buying more from China's rivals, including Mexico, Vietnam, and Thailand. Overall, the role of Chinese exports in the economy is declining. Its share in China's GDP has already fallen from 35% in 2010 to less than 20% today. The third factor we'll look at: consumer spending. As the Chinese economy turns inward, the outlook for consumer spending is also not looking great for the coming year.
Consumer spending is yet another one of the three carriages driving the Chinese economy. New variants of the virus continue to emerge, and Beijing's so-called zero-tolerance pandemic policy seems like it's there for good. As the rest of the world largely decides to coexist with the virus and is gradually opening up, the Chinese regime is still locking down cities, sealing off doors to businesses and people's homes, and pushing mass testing. Though the stringent measures may dampen consumer confidence and depress spending in 2022. With China's living costs on the rise, many residents still earn a comparably low income. A recent report shows that over 220 million people take home an average income totaling 500 yuan. That's the equivalent of just $80 a month, and is what 1/6 of China's population lives on. The report was published in November by leading Chinese investment banking firm China International Capital Corporation. The data reflects a statement from Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. He remarked last year that over 600 million people in China can barely make a monthly income of $160.
So let's move on to the fourth and fifth challenges: real estate as well as China's population crisis. NTD's Don Ma has more on that.
According to a Nikkei Asia report, the downturn on Chinese housing prices has spread from small cities to some of the country's largest ones. Since this summer, at least 20 Chinese cities have put a limit on housing price cuts into effect. And according to official data, 52 major cities saw new condo prices fall in October, compared to just 5 cities in May. Real estate accounts for about a quarter of China's GDP. The sector is expected to continue getting hammered next year, and the pressure will soon extend to local Chinese governments, many of whom rely on selling land use rights to support themselves. Some have already fallen deep in debt. As for the fifth factor, population. China's birth rate is hitting a record low, with just 1.3 children born per woman in 2020. That figure is similar to those of aging societies like Japan and Italy. What's more, that trend could pose huge ramifications for the country's economy. A renowned Chinese demographic expert recently told the South China Morning Post that the country's population is expected to peak in 2021 and fall steadily in the near future. That's much earlier than expected. A growing population brings more consumption, a stronger labor force, more tax revenue, and potentially more investment. But an aging one can significantly drag down a country's economy for years, with Japan as a notable example. Not just because of losing out on those benefits, but because senior citizens need more care and support while contributing smaller levels of tax revenue. A fertility expert known for his research on China told Reuters that Beijing may be downplaying how fast China's population is shrinking. Fu Xianyi from the University of Wisconsin estimated that China's 2020 population measured in at 1.28 billion rather than the 1.41 billion figure that's largely used, and notes that it's been shrinking since 2018.
Next up, unemployment. Tiffany has the outlook for us.
An expert inside China is warning about a massive wave of unemployment in the country. The analysis by renowned Tsinghua University sociologist Professor Sun Liping recently went viral. Sun said in a video that a huge wave of unemployment is coming to China, and this wave mainly comes from 5 sources. The first is potential massive layoffs in the real estate sector. Real estate accounts for 28% of China's GDP and 26% of urban employment. The current wave of potential defaults among real estate firms may threaten some portion of that workforce. Real estate giant Evergrande alone directly employs about 200,000 people, while also providing work for nearly 4 million. It works with over 8,000 upstream and downstream cooperative enterprises. Evergrande's default may have an impact on the workforce of these companies as well. According to the Chinese professor, other factors causing the unemployment wave include foreign companies and investment leaving China. That says Chinese authorities pass a series of laws, such as the anti-sanctions law and the data security law, making it harder for foreign firms to operate in the country. Sun said other factors include shutdowns of small and medium-sized enterprises and layoffs from the private tutoring companies. The regime banned such private tutoring firms from making profits, raising capital, or going public. That has caused massive downsizing, and the 10 million teachers in this sector face the danger of losing their jobs anytime. Japanese outlet Nikkei Asia cited analysts estimating that a third of such jobs, or 3 million people, could be unemployed due to the crackdown. And lastly, risks in the cross-border e-commerce sector. Amazon this year kicked off an extensive cleanup campaign targeting consumer review abuses. It shut down 3,000 Chinese online stores for their fake reviews. This and more future campaigns could have an impact on Chinese store owners who rely on these platforms to make a living. But these 5 factors may not be all. Other sectors in China are also seeing large-scale downsizing. Due to the regime's crackdown on the entertainment industry, China's Nasdaq-listed online streaming giant iQIYI is cutting 40% to 50% of its workforce. That's according to Chinese media interviews with their employees. Other industry leaders are also reportedly downsizing. Tech companies Tencent, Kaishou, and TikTok's parent company ByteDance are laying off workers. The Hong Kong-listed short video giant Kuaishou has reportedly started to let go of workers who received low scores in performance reviews.
And lastly, China's power crisis. The country experienced its worst ever power outage this year. Coal prices skyrocketed, households endured rolling blackouts, and factories across the country were forced to shut down. The shortage was partially caused by shuttered coal mines, and that's after severe flood damages, local officials' introduction of electricity rationing, as well as limited recovery of economic activities amid the pandemic. The country's power problem may extend into next year as demand rises in the winter. Financial service company Nomura said the Beijing Winter Olympics in February may also cause widespread factory shutdowns. And that's all for the economic trends to watch out for. Next, we talk about China's position in the world. The Chinese regime is drastically reducing China's contact with the rest of the world. They're isolating the country not just physically, but also ideologically. And this trend may extend into the next year. The pandemic made China close its borders. For the past 2 years or so, most Chinese were not allowed to travel abroad, and few foreigners had been allowed into the country. But strictly speaking, the trend of isolation is not new or solely driven by the pandemic. Chinese authorities have for years been tightening restrictions that is reflected in the regime's passport policies. Passports were extremely hard to get in China during the rule of communist leader Mao Zedong. Back then, the country was very isolated from the rest of the world. In 1978, among China's nearly 1 billion people, only tens of thousands had a passport. Now, after 4 decades of China's reform and opening up, passports are much easier to get. Official data shows that China's outbound travelers reached 155 million in 2019. But the country has seen a change in policy direction in recent years. Official data shows that China issued about 335,000 passports in the first half of 2021. That's only 2% of the number of passports issued for the same period in 2019. In August, Chinese officials announced that they will pause issuing passports for non-essential, non-urgent travelers. In recent years, the CCP has been forcing government workers, including public school teachers, to turn in their passports. The regime is calling it centralized management of passports. In 2013, a district in Guangzhou City became the first in the country to enforce the policy. Then in June 2020, the Chinese regime passed a law. It punishes officials who left the country without approval from authorities or applied for passports for private reasons. Such officials may be degraded or lose their jobs. Chinese netizens reported that going abroad has become more difficult than ever in 2021. Though the regime did not explicitly ban people from leaving the country, netizens shared personal experiences of being stopped by Chinese customs officers. Chinese media reported that in one case, a Chinese resident had his passport torn up by customs officers. That was when he tried to leave for the U.S. to take care of his injured wife. And a popular Chinese travel blogger posted about the issue on social media. It wrote that customs officers in Guangzhou City have extremely strict restrictions on international departures. Some people were advised to return and their plane tickets were invalidated. The regime has also been making it harder for foreigners to stay in China. This summer, to prevent negative coverage of the flood, Chinese state-affiliated organizations and media outlets reportedly encouraged residents to harass foreign journalists. Some foreign correspondents in China say they were surrounded by local residents on site while trying to interview people. Some even received death threats. The regime has also been pushing against cultural influences from the West. China's most cosmopolitan city, Shanghai, in August banned local elementary schools from holding final exams for English. Authorities this year cracked down on private tutoring institutions, many of which focus on teaching English. Chinese authorities also introduced Xi Jinping thought into the curriculum. It is now taught to millions of students across all school levels and in universities. And last year, the regime banned elementary and middle schools from using overseas textbooks. The Chinese regime has ramped up regulation over online data. It passed a new law making it harder for foreign companies or investors to get information like supplies and financial statements. One expert told the Wall Street Journal that China has always been a big black box. But given the regime's recent actions, he says the black box becomes even blacker. Even Xi Jinping himself couldn't avoid being affected by the trend of isolation. His last trip abroad was in January 2020. He was in Myanmar for 2 days to promote his Belt and Road Initiative and has not stepped outside of China since then. And a big question for 2022 and the following years is whether the Chinese regime will invade Taiwan. But what exactly could a Chinese invasion of Taiwan look like? A recent Reuters investigative report consulted military experts and listed out 6 potential scenarios. Let's take a look at each one of them.
Scenario 1 is a blockade of the Matsu Islands. They are a group of small islands controlled by Taiwan, but they're only 5 miles away from the shores of mainland China. The Taiwanese Coast Guard may be powerless to resist. Communist China could threaten and pressure Taiwan to come to the negotiation table for unification. If Taiwan rejects, the Matsu Islands could potentially fall under CCP rule. And the U.S. and its allies could impose trade and economic sanctions on Beijing. Scenario 2 is an invasion of Kinmen. This island, also controlled by Taiwan, is just 4 miles away from Chinese shores. This scenario would be similar to Scenario 1. Beijing could seize the island and demand that Taiwan accept a unification plan similar to the one Beijing had with Hong Kong. Namely, one country, two systems. Given what happened to Hong Kong, Taiwan may not accept the plan. This could lead to a U.S. and Japanese arms buildup in the region, as well as sanctions and embargoes on China. The third and fourth scenarios would be Beijing imposing either a snap custom quarantine or a full-on blockade on Taiwan. This would put Taiwan under a severe shortage of essential supplies, particularly energy. In the case of a full-on blockade, the CCP could even cut Taiwan's undersea cables. It would disrupt the island's communication with the outside world and isolate it. Beijing could then pressure Taiwan to come to the negotiation table to talk about unification. Scenario 5 would be for the Chinese military to launch massive air and missile attacks on key Taiwanese military and civil facilities, like command centers, ports, and communication networks. And Scenario 6 would be an all-out invasion. The CCP could launch both military operations and a psychological warfare through cyber attacks and misinformation campaigns. And they would target Taiwan's internet and telecom networks. The last scenario might cause tensions to escalate into a regional war in East Asia. But former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice says she's more worried about a CCP subversion of the Taiwanese government from within. At a panel discussion in October, Rice said Beijing could achieve its goal of conquering Taiwan through tactics similar to Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine. That is, using paramilitary forces to penetrate the nation, using social media to sow discord, and cutting underwater cables to disrupt Taiwan's communication. Beijing's infiltration campaign against Taiwan has been in operation for years. Their tactics include investing heavily in Taiwanese mainstream media. That way, it shifts their editorial stance to be more pro-Beijing. Other tactics include funding pro-Beijing candidates in elections and enlisting an internet army to attack political and social figures who are harsh on the Chinese regime.
Taiwan's defense ministry is releasing its latest threat assessment. The report says a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be extremely difficult for Beijing to pull off. Let's look at why that's the case.
In a report to lawmakers, Taiwan's defense ministry said there are three major weaknesses in the Chinese army's current strategy for a potential attack on Taiwan. First, the Communist Party's army does not have enough landing vehicles to send all of its troops to Taiwan at once. Instead, they'd have to be divided into multiple echelons, leaving the scattered forces at a disadvantage. Secondly, the Chinese force would first have to seize Taiwan's ports and airports to drop off its troops, but the Taiwanese army staunchly defend its ports and airstrips. A quick Chinese takeover would prove no easy feat. Thirdly, the Chinese military may face supply challenges. In order to restock Chinese troops, weapons, ammunition, food, and medicine would all have to be transported to the island over the Taiwan Strait. Experts say an all-out invasion of Taiwan would be the biggest and most complex amphibious landing ever attempted.
If the Chinese Communist Party attacks Taiwan by force, Taiwan has already thought through all the possible ways. Defensive operations on large islands are advantageous to the defender. Modern technology provides more cheaper and more effective options for the anti-landing side.
The report also notes the proximity of U.S. and Japanese bases to Taiwan, pointing out that the Chinese Communist military would have to retain forces to defend against intervention from the U.S. and Japan. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida pledged in November to consider all options to create a stronger self-defense force. That's to protect the country amid growing threats. And for the security situation around Japan, Kishida warned the reality is more severe than ever. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is also hinting at Japan's possible military role in a conflict over Taiwan.
There is no question that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would impose a significant risk to the land of Japan both geographically and spatially. A Taiwan emergency is a Japanese emergency, and therefore an emergency for the U.S.-Japan alliance. People in Beijing, especially President Xi Jinping, should never have a misunderstanding in recognizing this. I think that Japan, Taiwan, and all the democratic countries need to keep urging President Xi Jinping and the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party not to step onto a wrong path. Military misadventure would lead to economic suicide.
Overall, a full-on invasion would present huge risks for Beijing, though experts say the regime does have other means to bring Taiwan to its knees.
And that's it for today's and this year's China in Focus. Have a great New Year's Eve. Happy New Year, and see you next year.